Hello and welcome to the Startups of London podcast. I'm your host Ozan and the founder of Startups of London. Today, I'm joined by Giovanni Luperti, the CEO and founder of Humaans, and it's with double A, so I'm quite confused how to pronounce it. Humans.
Humans is perfect.
Okay, Humans. That's nice. Thank you for joining the chat, Giovanni. Tell us about the business. Tell us about yourself a bit, just to get us introduced, and then we'll dive into more interesting questions.
Thanks very much, Ozan, for having me today. Very, very exciting. In a nutshell, I'm Giovanni, co-founder, CEO of Humaans, born and raised in Italy. I moved from there to Milan. I studied communication design there and been now in London for 12 years, which has been a little while, but definitely a place that I love and call home. I've been in tech for pretty much my entire career. I work always with different startups, scale-ups, company at different stages of growth. I've seen, scaling companies from 10 people to 100, from the 300 to kind of 500, and then about 1,000 was kind of, the largest companies. And most recently, before starting Humaans, I was at Qubit, a B2B personalization company in London, where I met my co-founder, Carolis. And from there, we had this pretty special relationship. We managed to accomplish a lot in terms of building high quality software together. I was focusing on the product and design side. Carol was focusing on the engineering side. And that's where we started to kind of see some of the challenges within the people space. And we got really excited about the problem, and we decided to kind of, dive deeper into that. So yeah, that's kind of, very, in a nutshell, the story before we dive straight into Humaans.
Perhaps it's interesting to mention at this stage that I have actually worked in recruitment HR for quite a bit as an executive recruiter. My first company was in the recruitment space as well. So it is something that I've been exposed to. As you know, as a founder, when you build stuff, you do a lot of research around it, the competitors and so on. And the landscape is definitely changing. But what I have found out, having spoken with a lot of founders, there is definitely a problem, a set of big problems in the, let's say, HR tech space, which touches a bit on company culture, which touches a bit on the onboarding of staff, and that's first experience. A certain component of it touches to payroll and the other areas. So I think we are quite good as consumers when we see, okay, this works and this doesn't work. But then I see a lot of founders, a lot of businesses that make an attempt to unify, to fix, and I see a lot of them fail. Looking at the history of Humaans before this podcast, I've seen you have managed to grow quite a bit. So I would be really interested to understand what you're doing differently. But perhaps it would be good to start with, what is the pitch? What is the idea? What is the problem that you claim to solve? And then tell us how you went about it.
For us, it really started with the employee experience and transparency. Like when we were at Qubit, and again, a bunch of other startups that we work with, as a product people, you're always exposed to the best piece of tech, right? Everything is fast, everything is sleek. Use the Figma, use the Asana, incredible interaction model. And when you actually look at the landscape of HR software, for us was not the same level of quality, level of polish. And that's, again, specifically from a non-admin, let's say non-power user perspective, that got kind of our attention, right? So, okay, maybe there is something there. Why literally every single company, when they cross a certain size, they need a system of records for employee data, but why there is no kind of a real clear winner, why there is no some sort of Slack of HR, Stripe of HR, an extremely beautiful product with a strong interaction model. And then starting from there, we noticed a few other bits that were basically lacking, and they help us develop the product strategy for Humaans and the vision. The two components beyond the actual employee experience was around the automation. So this layer of integration, when you actually have incredible verticalized software like DocuSign doing one thing really well in the contract management side, or products like Greenhouse, given you've been on the recruitment side as well, just doing hiring, very well, or Lattice and Culture Ramp on the performance. But it was basically this missing layer connecting everything in a way that was kind of more robust. And the last one was around scalability. Like often companies, they started with kind of some sort of all-in-one model when they are a little bit smaller. And then as they transition in the company scaling, they're not necessarily ready to kind of tap into the, Workday, Oracle, or SAP of the world. So they start to develop more level of frustration with the stack. So they end up creating a custom stack that is hard to maintain. So they build their own custom connectors. They rely on engineering resources. So for us was more, can we actually build something that can help alleviate this pain and help companies that are transitioning from small to kind of a medium and larger before they're actually ready to kind of onboard into one of these, massive enterprise type of products. That was kind of, the start of the vision for us.
That's really interesting. I would really love to understand how that integration works. Perhaps if you could go into more detail. And for the sake of this example, let's compare a situation where a founder who has built their company from 5 to, let's say, 30 people have been relying on Notion, Slack, Greenhouse, and perhaps some Google spreadsheets in the back end. What does using Humans get that specific persona in that case?
The idea specifically is how do you make sure that you have this layer of infrastructure? This is basically acting in the background. So sometimes software tend to be a little bit, too much in your face. Like everybody's seeking more engagement, everybody's seeking more stickiness with the product, which is again totally fine. You get it. It's important. You want a product that people actually enjoy using. But there is some element, for example, you mentioned Slack. Like if I'm using Slack and I'm enjoying Slack, there's certain things that you can do that are related to people data. Like I want to see where people are. I want to see if someone is working from home. I want to see if someone is working from a different location or a kind of in a training or an event. And maybe I don't need to kind of log into the HR system to tap into the information. I would love for the information to be shown directly into kind of a dedicated Slack channel, for example. Or if I'm looking at the onboarding process, how do you make sure that we can streamline the process end to end to make sure that from the moment someone has been marked as hired in Greenhouse, data can get automatically ingested from Greenhouse into kind of Humans if you mapped basically the data with some sort of e-signature product, a contract management tool like DocuSign or similar products. How do you make sure that you can basically capture additional data points and basically fire a contract automatically when the contract is signed, automatically re-ingest under the profile, so you basically also improve the compliance element, so and streamline effectively an onboarding process end to end. So these are some of the bits that we've been looking at in terms of kind of automation. And obviously, as companies get larger and larger, this can be more meaningful and painful issues that we're trying to kind of help alleviate.
I've been just clicking around in your website, humans.io, for people who would like to visit. And I see integrations with G Suite, Calendar, Slack, Culture, and many more. I see data and analytics, insights, reports, and payroll summary. I also see some core HR functionality, such as employee database, documents, absence tracking, and so on. What I have seen and witnessed, both through my personal experience and vicariously through the people that I've spoken, is with some businesses, the idea and the execution quality, it has almost a certain balance. This specific business seems like success here is heavily reliant on execution quality, because the problems are there. The problems are visible. People agree on the problems, right? It's not a mystery that better software for people and culture management is needed, but how people go about it and how people solve the problems. So in essence, my question is, in terms of growing the team, in terms of growing the business and the user base, the marketing side of the business, the tech side of the business, it is a lot of hard work, isn't it?
And you mentioned something there about execution that I'm personally extremely passionate about. Like, we are operating in a category that is like very busy, very crowded, very competitive. There's lots of players. We obviously approaching this problem from an angle that we believe is different, is differentiated, like where we focus on best-in-class type of technology and play well with the ecosystem of other best-in-class compared to kind of all-in-one type model. But the reality is that execution is extremely important in order to succeed and obviously stand out, especially if the category is as crowded and as busy. And what I mean by that, you can start obviously on the product side. How do you make sure that the product is extremely high quality software? How do you make sure that you build a team of engineering, designers, product people that generally care about the craft and are prioritizing things by working extremely close with the users? From a sales perspective or a marketing perspective or a customer success and support perspective, how do you make sure that the experience with customers is not transactional, for example? With the space that we operate in, often we have conversation with people where they feel a little bit frustrated because HR buyers, people buyers, don't necessarily experience really high quality processes during a buying cycle. So for us, it was pretty insightful, and maybe coming from, let's say, a naive way of a product guy approaching sales, for me, it was really important to say, okay, I want to make sure that people understand that we are product experts. I don't want to try and sell for the sake of selling. I generally want to make sure that we align on a problem that the customer is experiencing, and we are the right partners to solve the problem and guiding them through the journey. So these for us are elements of execution, and I can really exceed expectations with people, just putting lots of care in everything that you do. Doesn't matter if it's product, doesn't matter if it's sales, doesn't matter if it's support and success.
What do you think has been your competitive advantage? I know you've been part of the YC group, and perhaps within that answer, there is some also insight about how it is different to build a startup in the US, the US mentality versus the UK, and perhaps even the more European mentality, because I think you have a perspective having been grown up in Milan. So 3 different samples from 3 different places in the world. I would love to hear your personal experience and thoughts on that.
Yeah, we went through the YC program beginning of last year. Was the remote program, unfortunately, so I haven't experienced the full San Francisco YC journey there, but a good portion, I think,
it still counts as you were exposed to many people.
Yes, 100%, and the majority of or a good portion, let's say, of our investors are also American investors from the Bay Area, but we got lots of exposure to founders. There's a few different elements that we observe, both from like raising capital perspective, also how do you think about building business or going to market as well. One element, for example, for us specifically, is around the buyers and how they process things, how they think about the process. Like in the US, for example, people tend to be less risk averse. When they adopt a new technology, there is this element around, I want to be part of this exciting journey at the very start, and I want to try and contribute. So that is kind of, really fascinating. And
a bigger appetite for risk is
yes, and we've seen a lot of that in the US versus when we have conversation with buyers in Europe, and Europe has been our focus. The majority of the companies we work with are in the UK and expanding globally as well. But there is more an element of risk awareness. It's more an element of is this company, is this technology secure? Is this company that is putting lots of effort and care around the right components of building the business? It's going to be stable. It's going to be around for a long time. Like there's more an element of this. You need to guide people through their journey and explain why you're going to put, focus on the right elements and not just get them excited about the incredible vision, the incredible investor, which is definitely a portion of the equation, but is less prominent compared to what we've seen in the US.
It seems the mentality, in my understanding, is let's build it once, let's build it good, make sure it works, double check, triple check, and then let it work, leave it be. Whereas in the US model, it's more built around iteration, constant change, being okay with change, and perhaps even when you implement something, having a certain feeling, okay, this is not going to be permanent, perhaps we'll need to change this in a year or two, is kind of perhaps the difference. It sounds like a small difference, but it makes a huge difference in the user and the buying behavior. So where's your customer base with that thought in mind? Is it US-based? I'm guessing it's international. If so, do you observe any differences between how your customers think and act based on whether they're from Europe or from the UK or from US?
From a go-to-market perspective, we've been focused and building for Europe. As I mentioned, we've got a good portion of the customer base there is in the UK, a meaningful portion that is in kind of broader across Europe, Northern Europe specifically. But the way we designed the product composition was very much to support distributor organizations. So something where we've got a meaningful level of success was tapping in companies that were in Europe, but expanding international as well. So as of today in Humaans, we support employees across over 100 regions globally. So we have companies employing people in China, Japan, all Europe, US, Brazil. So there's definitely a component that's very much international, but specifically from, again, a focus and go-to-market. Europe is the main focus. There's also a specific reason, and that is about the buyer persona that we work with, like HR people, they tend to be very community-driven. So what we observe is that the moment you can tap into a small group of people and we drive value for them, they get really excited about technology, they get really excited about sharing within the community. So there is a very important element of adoption through communities that we're trying to leverage also as much as possible.
Can you let me understand what is the advantage of focusing on a certain geography, let's say in your case, UK and Europe, versus going all global? Because when you focus, of course, there might be advantages with it, but you're leaving out a huge market, right? The US and the others. So why not treat the whole global market as a single market and go, what is the case against it? What is the advantage of focusing on a single market in your case?
The way I personally see it, like from a technology perspective, you could do that. You can focus on making sure that your product is robust and can support a global audience. And there is a number of components that we're already building to technology. But the challenge is, again, how people buy technology. What's the type of team composition that you need to have? Going back to what we discussed about, the buyer being a little bit more risk averse in Europe versus like more visionary in the US, you need to build a different sales function to go to market in Europe. This means that if I would have, we'd have to go to the US today and say, okay, I want to set up a presence in New York or San Francisco. We need to look at what the characteristics of the sales people there. Like, how do we think about building a sales motion? How do we think about, selling to those people as well? So there is that component there. And there's obviously an element of cost as well, which can impact. So first of all, ramp might be a little bit, slower because you're familiar with the market. So you need to familiarize with different market. Costs, they're also obviously different in the UK or Europe versus US, and they can be both from a marketing perspective, marketing channels, or even from a salary perspective, where compensation in the buy area is more meaningful and higher, compared to hiring a team in London or in Europe. So these are some of the consideration where you want to be extra cautious before you just go crazy and global. The ambition that we have is obviously a meaningful ambition. We obviously want to be the global business. But the way you get there, you want to be mindful with the approach because it can be extremely expensive to go global from day one.
I'm fascinated by this very specific conversation. I think it's like a very rich, fruitful dialogue. So I want to dig in a bit more here. How do you think the sales persona or the sales team, perhaps the personality, I should say, of the salespeople and the system, the structure, the process that you set up, how do you think these are different in the US versus in Europe?
I think there is definitely this element of consultative versus transactional, but it's also the type of let's say companies that you can tap into and learn from. Like something that is an advantage in the US, for example, is there's so many SaaS businesses that got to kind of a meaningful level of scale. So there's definitely this element of tapping into talent. They've got a lot of experience. People that have seen a company scaling from like 10, 20 to kind of 100,000 people and a substantial revenue acceleration there. So the ability to tap into the talent can be extremely, extremely powerful and appealing. Versus
you got more talent, which
has
experience in scaling an organization and perhaps a bit more okay with uncertainty and knows how to deal with clients' issues and questions that come up in a certain setup, right? So that's number one.
And there's also a component of how talent perceive the opportunity of working at a startup. like going back again to this risk-averse component, what I've personally
Mm,
experienced is that more talent understand the value of equity, for example, in an early stage business,
gotcha.
because the ecosystem there is more mature. So there are more companies that go to a meaningful level of scale. We see the Dropbox of the world, the Slack of the world, the Asana of the world. And this company obviously were transformative for a number of very early employees.
Yeah.
In Europe, there is definitely less of that. So
When you see a
startups,
5-person, sorry to interrupt, when you see a 5-person company, for example, in Europe, the perception might be, this looks like it might go out of business in the next 1.5, 2 years. Perhaps I should better stick with my organization, which is like 400, 500 people or even bigger. Whereas in the US, it's like, yeah, maybe this organization can go up to 60 people and then 300 people, and I would be one of the first 10 employees. Is that accurate?
100%, 100%. And this is why we often see actually the early employees of American companies actually transitioning to the US. They are, doing phenomenally well in Europe, but they only have a limited level of exposure, right? So if I'm starting as a salesperson at, Asana, for example, with 300 employees in the US, and I'm the first salesperson in the UK, unfortunately, the level of exposure they're not going to get to like the product teams and how certain decisions get made is going to be a little bit more limited. But it would be beautiful, obviously, for more people to kind of, join startups early in Europe when these decisions are basically being made here, when they get exposure to product, they can see what's the rationale basically around certain things, and they can educate the way you go to market, can serve you as a better leader when you actually have this conversation with prospects as well. You have more knowledge that you can leverage effectively.
Does the sales pipeline work any different, the sales process and the pipeline, in terms of demoing the product, the initial meetings, the pace of that conversation? How would you compare both markets?
I guess the experience we have with the US is a little bit limited compared to what we've seen in Europe.
Mm,
What I've seen in
that's
terms
true.
of pipeline is that there is definitely a level of acceleration that you can get in the US based on the number of companies. Like US obviously is a really big market. That's a reality. So if you focus, let's say, extremely narrow on small businesses in the UK, they've got some specific characteristics that you're going after. Maybe you're focusing on tech businesses, professional services. The pool of companies is smaller. So the velocity in which you can build pipeline can be a little bit slower compared
Mm,
to having a similar focus in the US, where actually the pool of companies can be maybe 10 times, 20 times bigger. So you get
got it.
more level of acceleration.
And just for our listeners, I would like to underline and emphasize a certain point. Whether you get to a certain milestone in 6 months versus 14 months makes a huge difference in the world of a startup, because you always have a limited amount of months, a limited runway. So that's actually a life or death timer ticking for any company, actually, because you have all these costs. So it makes a huge difference actually when you look at it from that perspective.
But obviously, that doesn't mean that you can build a really meaningful businesses by
Yeah,
focusing on Europe. Like, because again, Europe is an incredible ecosystem. There's lots of businesses that are growing exceptionally well. So it's more about how big is your market, what is your focus, and how you go about tapping into the companies that are right for you at the specific stage of growth, and based on your product, of course.
I would like to touch on two more points, Giovanni. One of them is the decision making, and the other one is the resource management aspects of building a startup, which I think both are crucial in your case and in most people's cases. So let's start with the resource management part, and then we can perhaps dive into how you manage that resource, how you make decisions around that. But the resource itself, when I say resource, I think about two things. One of them is essentially the investments that you have had, or it could be a customer funded business as well. So essentially money. The second part of the resource is the people. So can you tell us a bit about it? I know you're a company of 30 plus people. Am I
Mhm.
am I right in that? Have you received
Yes.
any investment? How was that landscape? How was the first initial days of the company? And with that, how long has it been since you launched? I never asked that.
Yeah, I mean, we are relatively new to the market. We've been building Humans for a little over 2 years now, so it's
Okay.
still relatively early days. Team of over 30 people now, and we raised about 20 million in total to date.
What was the first round that you like? Okay, if you
We
could.
raised a first round last year. We raised 5 million in total.
So you built something and then you raised. How did that go?
I can share a little bit more around that. Basically, Carolis and I, we moved on from Qubit and we had this vision for Humans. But before starting straight to building Humans, we decided to kind of bootstrap it effectively. So we built first some sort of, another business, let's say, was a vehicle to bootstrap Humans, really, was a
Hmm.
product agency. But what we did from there is the capital that we made from the venture, we reinvested straight into building the first version of the product. From there, as we were acquiring more customers and we realized that there was a meaningful level of traction, we decided to go down the venture route.
So it
And we
started
started
like a
working with
service-oriented business, which created its own product, and then you
correct.
focused on the product more and more, I guess.
Correct. So it was effectively not focusing on the HR component. The other business was nothing to do with it, but we used it as a vehicle to basically get some capital without going to the venture route.
That's very smart. That's a good plan. I've seen this work with some other companies
Yeah.
as well. It's like, I think, a very unique way of doing a business, but I think it works. And
It's really important because we really want to make sure that it was something meaningful to be built. And sometimes, obviously, in the craze of last year, some companies were able to tap into capital in a way that was, easier, let's say, compared to previous periods and previous cycles. But for us, was really we want to make sure before we tap into capital that we actually have something that we have extremely high conviction. We believe there is some level of traction. We believe there's some level of demand. And that's how we really approached it. So from there, we went down raising some capital. We connect with a number of incredible investors, and then we got accepted into Y Combinator as well. So we decided to take some money from Moonfire Venture, Y Combinator. We brought on board a number of incredible investors. We got Frontline involved, Rocky Groom as well. And from there, this was our first set of capital raise, which again totaled to 5 million, which we announced early last year in March. And the team was still relatively small. And from there, we decided to be a little bit contrarian, let's say, compared to what was happening in the market. Like last year was a crazy market, right? Where companies capitalized in a way that was incredible. Teams were scaling extremely fast. For us, it was a little bit different. Like despite the capital, we decided to hire relatively slowly. We wanted to focus on the core business fundamentals. We wanted to prove that the product was strong. We wanted to build in the right way for the right set of customers. And this enabled us actually to make sure that our bar was relatively low. And when we then, go to a meaningful level of scale, a meaningful level of customers, and this year decided to go down and raise more capital, despite the market climate that is very different compared to the landscape we had last year, we were in a very strong position because we didn't need to raise because we still have plenty of money left, plenty of runway, but that enabled us to be in a very strong position to tap into capital at the terms that were right for us and enable us to get more acceleration as well.
what do you think is making you most attractive to the investors?
There's a few components. I'd say definitely the market that is crowded, but still there is no real winner, a category leader in a market that, as I mentioned, is really, really massive. There's definitely few players that capitalize exceptionally well and they're doing, well, but they are, very similar in terms of like product composition. So there's definitely this element for us, which is more about, again, the best in class verticalized product approach. Market is very big. And execution, going back to what we discussed at the beginning, around how to make sure that we build an exceptional product, how to make sure we build an exceptional team, how to make sure that we focus on the right business fundamentals. That was a key components and key parts of why investors were really excited about joining us in this journey and supporting us as we scale.
I've also, looking back at your profile, seen you have worked as a mentor in a few places, such as
Yep.
Techstars and Seedcamp, which are, and Level 39 as well. They're quite high profile names, all of them. In your experience, how has that helped you make decisions, think about decision making? And how does it perhaps co-play with the other people that you have in your organization? What is your thinking process about decision making and resource management and directing resources.
The most impactful things when you're part of communities and networks, and I guess our cap table as well is kind of a bit of a reflection of that. When you have lots of investors, they're operators, they've got experience, is the ability to tap into these community networks and people and absorb learnings from them. For me personally, coming from a product background, I definitely had some gaps on certain aspects of building a company, right? For example, sales. I never done that myself. So I needed to kind of bridge some of those gaps, and the ability to have conversation with people that have done that was really, really helpful to kind of help me think, okay, how do we think about, building a sales motion? How do we think about building a go-to-market function? Similarly, on the marketing side, or sharpen up some aspects of product. And maybe, okay, I'm a product person. I know how to do things in a certain way, but how do you elevate that? How do you accelerate that? How do you get more product velocity? So by having the ability to have those conversations, then you can do pattern matching in a way that is way faster. And that obviously is going to elevate the way in which you can do decision making, because you've seen things already, like you had this conversation already, so you can spot risks in a way that is way more fast and efficient, and support the team in the best possible way. So, okay, we know that we can anticipate this as a risk, so we might want to allocate more resources. We need to hire more people into a certain area of the business, because I had a number of conversations with people that have been through the journey before and have experienced the pain before. So we know that we might get more risks on the side of the business, and let's try and mitigate before it's actually a problem. So that is the real component, in my opinion, that they get unlocked by having those conversations.
Fascinating. I have so many questions, so many more questions to ask you, but I think you've done amazingly well. I mean, what an experience! And with Humaans, it's kind of like a textbook example of how to operate in a market where the problem is perhaps apparent, but there are a lot of competitors, and execution quality matters most. So I think there are quite a bit of innovative approaches that you have done. Perhaps that goes beyond product innovation in the way that I see, Giovanni, is perhaps innovation of the business model, innovation of how you make and build the team, and how you choose to grow. So a lot of good things going for it. And I think this conversation was really insightful. Hopefully it was as such for our listeners as well. But that's all we have time for today. So thank you for joining.
Also, thanks very much. Massively appreciate you having me. Thank you.